Hello, I am your host for A Psych for Sore Minds. My name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I live and work in London. Okay, so this video is a sequel to my previous video where I talked about topics like what is a psychopath, are all mass murderers psychopaths, and also why do psychopaths do so well in the corporate world. So if you don't know the answers to those questions, then I'd recommend that you go back and check that video first, though you're all big boys and big girls, you're wearing your big pants, so I'll let you decide for yourself. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about an ex-patient of mine who was clinically diagnosed as being a psychopath, and he really sticks in my head. And at the time, I was a junior forensic psychiatrist, and I was working for a personality disorder unit for offenders. As always, I've changed some of the demographic details of the patient, Mr. P is his name, to make him less identifiable out of respect for patient confidentiality and for his victims. But I just want you to know that the essence of this case is 100% real. Before I start telling you about Mr. P, I'm going to very quickly tell you a bit about this channel. Are you interested in true crime? How about mental illness? Why not both? Welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds, the only YouTube channel that I'm aware of that addresses the crossroads of the two. And I'm your host, Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders so you don't have to. I work in prisons and in courts and in secure psychiatric units. And on top of all of that, I also work as an expert witness to advise courts and judges during criminal trials across the whole of the UK. So this channel dissects a whole range of mental health topics, some related to violence and offending, and some not, some that are more familiar to the average person, including interviewing real-life people who have suffered from serious mental illness. So what I'm saying is there's something for everybody. Okay, that's my spiel. Now back to Mr. P. So Mr. P had a very harsh upbringing, which is typical for psychopaths. He was emotionally and physically chastised by his father regularly. And there were also reports that he was even left to fend for himself overnight at home alone as a child on several occasions. Even when he was as young as 6 years old, his father would go off drinking with his buddies. Now, I've got a 5-year-old son and a 7-year-old son, and I would never dream of going off drinking with my buddies. Well, I might dream about it, or maybe fantasize about it. Yeah, it would be amazing, but I would never actually do it. So in my therapy sessions with Mr. P, he told me about some of his childhood memories, and this included that his father would regularly cheat on his mother, and he would actually drive round to these women's houses with Mr. P, a young child, and make him wait in the car. And this happened when he was as young as 5. And he would just leave him there for about an hour or so while he, did the deed. And Mr. P was just left there, no toys, nothing. And what he said to me once, which is really poignant, is that he remembered that if he was lucky, he might get invited in to the woman's house and he might be given a cookie or something. So it's actually really sad. And it reminds us of an uncomfortable truth within forensic psychiatry, which is this: the vast majority of my patients and the vast majority of defendants that I see and that I assess in court, either with mental illnesses or without, are victims in some way at some point in their lives themselves. That's not to excuse their actions, I'm just saying it's quite easy to vilify them, and life is not black and white, and neither are people. So as an adult, Mr. P had been on the fringes of the criminal underworld and was in and out of prison for a series of petty crimes, minor assaults. And before he came to our services, he was working for various drug dealers and pimps. He was just like a low-level errand boy. And in terms of his index offence, so that's the offence that brought him to the attention of forensic psychiatric services, this was in relation to kidnapping and assaulting a security guard who worked in a depot that Mr. P used to frequent, and that was part of his job. He used to store items like drugs and guns for his bosses. And Mr. P was homeless at the time, and the man, the security guard, had slighted him and made a comment about how smelly he was and how disheveled Mr. P was, and he did this in front of another colleague. and they both started laughing at him. And I spoke to Mr. P about his index offence at length, and because that was part of his rehabilitation. And what I think is interesting is that he was kind of friends, or at least acquaintances, with the security guard. And he told me that even after he made the comment, which I think was supposed to be in jest, the two men shared a cigarette together. But Mr. P said he just couldn't stop thinking about the comment later on that night, and it brought back memories of his own father mocking him as a kid. So his own father would call him smelly, which is obviously very harsh because it's the father's responsibility to look after him, so it's his fault if he was a smelly kid. So Mr. P came back the next day and he took this security guard hostage and he held him in a room which was like a locked room at the back of the depot for over 12 hours. And he tortured this man, he tied him up, and he even left the scene on a couple of occasions to go on a couple of errands and then came back. So he burned him and he stabbed him a few times. Although it was relatively superficial, he did need a couple of stitches. I think it was more psychological than physical scarring. And I think it was about control and inflicting pain. Control and inflicting fear rather than inflicting pain from Mr. P's perspective. So then Mr. P realised he would either have to release this man or kill him, and luckily he did the latter. He tried to get the security guard to promise that he wouldn't go to the authorities, and the man did promise that, but of course he went straight to the police when he was released, and Mr. P was arrested. And then he spent many years in prison before he was transferred to our psychiatric ward. And interestingly, from what I've read, the prison notes, he was a model prisoner for almost all of the time, but he would commit sudden and very serious violence, and this happened on at least 2 occasions, and it led to like an increase in his prison sentence. So on one occasion he burnt a man's face with burning water and sugar, and that's a common tactic in prison. They use boiling water, they put sugar in it so that it burns and it sticks to the victim's face, so it causes more damage. And nobody actually knows what this was about because Mr. P and also the victim didn't snitch, but I kind of wonder whether Mr. P was slighted by this man and that's how he took his revenge. So there was something spookily placid about Mr. P. To put this in context, everybody in this particular ward had a personality disorder as opposed to florid mental illness. As you would expect, similar to prison, there was a lot of cliques and there was a lot of issues between patients, and there was some bullying. There was like a really obvious hierarchy. So for example, there were 2 paedophiles on the ward and they were always bullied and harassed. But Mr. P didn't really slot into this hierarchy. He was generally settled and he didn't really have any enemies. And whereas some of the other patients would have fights or beefs or become agitated or distressed or would lose their temper once in a while, Mr. P never did. Interestingly, there were some occasional accusations that he'd been bullying some of the other patients covertly, but this was never done in front of anybody, so it's never proven. And some staff, I think including myself if I'm being honest, assumed that these allegations were simply not true. But now, in retrospect, I think that he was a psychopath and he was very good at manipulating the system. So Mr. P came across as very eloquent, very intelligent, and he was also very smartly dressed, which is very different to most of his other peers on the ward. There was a lot of sagging jeans, to the point, and I'm not kidding here, that we needed to have a community meeting with the patients because nobody wants to see a sea of butt cracks when they come to work. So Mr. P's smart presentation is quite interesting given that he grew up in relative poverty, including being raised by travellers for a few years because his parents kind of abandoned him. And I wonder whether that is him manipulating his own image, or at least the perception of other people that have about him, so whether that's a form of him indirectly lying. So Mr. P was pretty much the perfect patient, just like in prison. I just realised that's a lot of alliteration, isn't it? The perfect patient, just like in prison. He was very calm, he engaged in all his therapy, he was really well motivated, he was quite pally and polite with the staff. He always had good banter, good conversation, for example, talking about football, and he was impressively well read. And he wasn't the only patient on the ward that was like this. There were a couple more. And I had just begun my forensic psychiatry training at this point. And I remember thinking to myself on more than one occasion, why is Mr. P even on this ward? He doesn't seem to have a personality disorder. But how wrong I was. He also seemed to have constructed like a veneer with little emotion on the outside, even though an important part of his therapy was talking about his emotions, both historical emotions and in childhood, and also during the index offence, and also his emotions and feelings feelings during the current time. So if there are any episodes or altercations or issues on the ward, part of the therapy was to talk about that. And all the patients lived very tightly together, and they all had personality disorders and they all had violent pasts, so that happened actually quite often. But there was something a bit off about Mr. P. When he talked about his emotions, for example, his dad cheating, being left in the car as a kid, he did it in a very kind of calculated way. He didn't really seem to be letting anybody into his heart or into his mind. And I don't think I fully really understood what was happening at that point, but I do now in retrospect. So I can put it another way. I felt emotions of some kind towards most other patients at some point in my time on that ward. I got on well with some of the patients, have a bit of banter. Some were challenging, some were passive aggressive, some were intentionally disruptive, some were even threatening, and I was threatened on a few occasions. But at least I could get a sense of how I felt towards them or how they felt towards me and about how they felt towards other staff. But with Mr. P, there was nothing. He was just like a blank slate. He was like an unknown entity. In fact, to be perfectly honest, he came across more like a member of staff than he did as a patient. And in fact, we had a trainee psychologist on our ward who shadowed for a few weeks, and that person was even shocked to find out after a few days that Mr. P was even a patient. They thought he was a staff member. And Mr. P, on the surface at least, did exceptionally well in his therapy. He said and did all the right things. He reflected on his previous offending and problematic behaviour, or so we thought. Mr. P eventually earned escorted leave, and he went out with staff members several times, and that went absolutely fine. Obviously, we are rehabilitating patients to eventually be discharged to the community, so we need to have leave for testing. It's important to make sure that patients don't become institutionalized. And then Mr. P started having short periods of unescorted leave, which went fine for a few weeks. However, he very suddenly escaped. He took a train to Scotland, where he was caught a couple of months later by police. And then Mr. P went straight to jail. No more rehabilitation, no more treatment in a psychiatric unit. He did not pass go. He did not collect £200. But what's interesting is Mr. P seemed to have planned this out very well. And I believe he planned to do this all along, all the way from the beginning. So he had us hoodwinked. Okay, now I'm going to share some of my thoughts of what it's like to work with a psychopath. So as well as being a forensic psychiatrist, I took on a different role for a short period of time several years ago. I was the director of a small third sector mental health organisation which was just north of London. And in my opinion, my ex-boss was a psychopath. Now obviously I'm not going to give away too many identifying details because you don't have to be a professional to know that you don't want to piss off a psychopath. But the CEO of this organisation, we'll call him Mr. E, was very charming. He always seemed to be smiling, it was always pleasant, and people seemed to warm to him. At least that's what I thought initially. I later learned that he didn't have any kind of qualifications or degree, yet had made it to CEO. I know this might sound quite judgmental, but it's not meant to be. I'm not saying that somebody without qualifications can't be CEO. Sir Richard Branson famously left school without any qualifications, and his Virgin Group, which has since expanded to an umbrella of more than 100 companies, is now, and he's worth £4 billion, so you know, kid did well. I'm just making an observation that I wonder if this reflects Mr. E's psychopathy, whether he was able to manipulate the corporate world, and I talk more about that on my previous episode. Put it this way, every other director and every single member of the board, so we're talking over 20 people, aside from Mr. E, did have formal qualifications to university level. So it took me a while to figure this out, but everybody in the head office was absolutely petrified of Mr. E, and I'd hear these whispers within the head office, and I think at first they kept this from me because I was a new member of staff, and as far as anybody knew, I might go and snitch back to Mr. E. And there were small things like staff night outs or lunches without Mr. E, and at first I thought it was just people might not want to socialise with the main boss being around because they might feel they couldn't really be themselves, which I think is understandable. Then I noticed that he would check the clock, and he would make it very clear that he was disappointed if anybody came back a minute late from lunch, or if they left work a minute early, even if they'd done all the work for the day. And just things started to feel very odd at head office. And then I would start noticing some of the other things that Mr. E was doing that were frankly wrong, and there are hundreds of things, and this was eventually escalated to a formal grievance with the board members. I'm not going to go through all of his actions, I'll just talk you through key ones that I remember. So Mr. E used to make people change the notes of minutes of the meetings that they were in that he had not attended. And this would be because he had a particular opinion, or he wanted a decision to go a certain way. He wanted to make it look as if everybody already shared that opinion. But what was difficult was that these minutes were sometimes being sent to people outside of our organization, which is potentially very dangerous and professionally embarrassing, because they can just, they can tell that we were lying. And on several occasions, Mr. E asked staff members directly to lie to other people on his behalf, including asking me to do this. I have to say he was very casual, as if he was just kind of asking us to file a report or something. It was almost like he was grooming us and giving us a false sense of security. To me, there was a powerful sense that Mr. E needed to control everything. So I'll give you an example. On one occasion, I casually mentioned that I wanted to arrange some post-work drinks, and he basically said that I couldn't. He said that he was going to do something similar, some sort of formal launch for a new service within our organization, which was about to open, and he was going to do that in a few days. And I thought he'd misunderstood, and I sort of quite jovially explained, no, I'm not talking about that service. I'm talking about a completely different set of staff members who work in the head office. This is something different. I just wanted to suggest a meal and some drinks. And Mr. E basically told me that I was not allowed to do it. And this was an absolute shock to me, because I'm a grown-ass man, and I'm a director, and I'm a doctor, and I was basically being told by somebody else that I wasn't allowed to arrange work drinks outside of my usual working hours. And to be honest, I didn't really know how to react to it at the time. And before I could kind of stand up for myself or argue the point, he'd already gone on to the next point in the meeting. The other thing is that Mr. E would make huge plans or changes within the organization without even informing or checking with the various key people. For example, he would take massive chunks out of the whole organization's budget without the consent or even the knowledge of the financial director. As another example, he would suddenly hire or promote people within the organization without going through any kind of formal process or even an interview or even telling the HR director until it had already happened. To be perfectly honest, I think that this might have included hiring me, and I didn't realize this initially, but I think that he basically hired me because of my professional qualifications and my professional standings. I don't think he gave a shit about my actual opinions. He just wanted me to be like a puppet to push his views. And he forced this on me slowly, but he did it so gradually that I almost didn't really notice it was happening. The other thing is that Mr. E would decide who to invite to professionals meetings, and this would be very random and very kind of fractured. So much so that most senior staff were never together at the same time, so nobody ever really knew what was going on in the organization. And this created a very bizarre environment where several different people were working on the same project without even knowing it. And I think this was all so that Mr. E could control the outcome. So obviously staff members suggested that we should have more meetings, but Mr. E would refuse it. And also he insisted that he had to be at every meeting. So it got into a slightly ridiculous situation where there would be secret meetings held in the head office whenever Mr. E left. Not to do anything backhanded, but actually to get on discussing the proper work, the routine work that we were supposed to be doing. I mean, it was crazy. What I think is very interesting is the way that Mr. E did this. I rarely heard him speak in an aggressive tone, rarely heard him raise his voice. It was actually quite the opposite. He did everything in quite a casual, calm, sort of charming manner. It all seemed normal. And in fact, I think that made it even harder to argue against him. But I personally could sense that the ship was sinking, and I got the hell out of Dodge as fast as I could. And all I do know is that several formal grievances were raised against Mr. E. And I also know that all of those people who made the grievances left within a few weeks, and Mr. E is still there. So you can make of that what you want. So, dear viewers, does that sound familiar to you at all? Have you ever worked with a psychopath? Do you know any psychopaths? Please tell me in the comment sections below. I would love to hear from you. I'm going to do a video soon about my thoughts about whether Michael Jordan is a psychopath. There's a particular reason I've chosen him, but I'll explain that in the video. It's going to be a bit lighthearted and a bit of fun. You beautiful people, I would love for you to subscribe to our channel. Not only does it help me out personally immeasurably, but it will guarantee you a white Christmas this year. I'd also love some more comments. So the viewing numbers are fairly decent, but there's not as much discussion as I would like. Really keen to talk about all these issues. So if you're able to put some comments, I'll jump on myself and I will reply to you, or I'll give you my thoughts if that's what you want. So follow us on Instagram, like our Facebook page, and submit episode ideas or any questions to our email, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. And if you reference us, use #PsychSore. Please tell all your favourite people about Psych for Sore Mind. Spread the love, they deserve it. And, as always, until next time, stay euthymic, homies.